Standing on a flat stretch of agricultural bottomland along the Grand River in southern Ontario, a person sees only what appears to be a completely ordinary cornfield. The soil is dark, rich, and turned over in smooth, parallel furrows that stretch toward the tree line without a single break or surface irregularity. It looks like farmland that has contained nothing more complex than crops and seasonal mud for generations. Then the plow strikes something hard beneath the topsoil, and the earth turns out to be holding hundreds of human remains. What is remarkable about the event that occurred in Haldimand County is not simply that a vast collective burial was uncovered beneath the crops, but that its true nature went unexamined by specialists for decades, while a sensational myth of armored giants took its place in the public record. How many of the reported anomalies scattered across the geography of Canada are merely misread history, and how many conceal a genuine, forgotten population that vanished without a trace? To understand how these reports spread, it is necessary to examine what people in the 19th century assumed about the land they were clearing. The settlers who moved into the Grand River Valley viewed the terrain as a blank slate, a quiet, unpeopled wilderness waiting to be parceled out into township concessions and deeded acreage. That assumption was entirely reasonable for those who arrived with no knowledge of the deep human occupation that preceded them. The first crack in that worldview appeared the moment a steel blade sheared off the top of an ancient structure buried just inches below the grass. To understand what lay beneath the soil near Cayuga, one has to reconstruct the deep human geography of southern Ontario long before 19th-century agricultural survey lines were drawn. The Grand River watershed, sweeping through what is now Haldimand County, forms a glacial spillway carved out during the retreat of the Laurentide ice sheet roughly 12,000 years ago. As the ice sheet withdrew northward, it left behind thick deposits of fertile alluvial silt, clay, and sand across gentle river terraces. These well-drained lowlands became ideal corridors for human habitation, trade, and seasonal travel. Over thousands of years, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Neutral Nation established complex settlements along these waterways, utilizing the river for transportation and the arable terraces for agriculture. The specific burial practice that created the dense concentration of remains found in 1871 is rooted in a centuries-old spiritual and social tradition known as the Feast of the Dead. Practiced extensively by Iroquoian peoples, including the Huron-Wendat and the Neutral Nation, this ceremony occurred every 10 to 15 years, or whenever a village relocated. Communities would carefully disinter the remains of relatives who had died since the last gathering. Bones were cleaned, wrapped in fine furs, and carried to a central location. There, in a profound act of collective mourning and social unity, hundreds of individuals were laid to rest together in a single, large pit known archaeologically as an ossuary. These earthen vaults were often lined with beaver robes and accompanied by grave goods, beads, tools, and worked native copper items crafted from metal traded across vast networks stretching to Lake Superior. When agricultural settlement accelerated across Upper Canada in the early to mid-19th century, thousands of square kilometers of forest were cleared for wheat and corn production. Settlers working with heavy timber plows began slicing through topsoil that had remained undisturbed for centuries. Because these ossuaries were intentionally constructed on low, sandy knolls or elevated river benches to prevent water accumulation, they were precisely the spots farmers targeted for planting. In October 1871, on land associated with the Fredenberg family near Cayuga, a plow blade caught the edge of one of these ancient communal pits. What came out of the ground was an intricate array of human remains and oxidized metal. The native copper ornaments, having rested against bone and damp soil for hundreds of years, had corroded into brilliant blue-green copper carbonate. To an untrained observer in 1871, unfamiliar with Indigenous metallurgy or the taphonomy of buried bone, the green metallic sheen on the rib cages looked like brass plating or body armor. The disarticulated skeletons, lying out of anatomical alignment and shifted by centuries of frost heave, were hastily measured in the dirt by onlookers who mistook scattered limb bones for 7-foot giant frames. Local newspapers picked up the story, exaggerating the dimensions and substituting speculation for measurement, transforming a sacred Haudenosaunee, or Neutral Nation ossuary, into a sensational headline about a lost race of armored giant warriors. This pattern of misinterpretation was not unique to Haldimand County. Across southern Ontario, similar sites were disturbed as farmland expanded. Near Rice Lake in Northumberland County, the Serpent Mound, a sinuous earthwork nearly 60 meters long built by Point Peninsula cultures roughly 2,000 years ago, faced similar wild speculation when 19th-century settlers first encountered it. Rather than recognizing the sophisticated earth-moving engineering of Indigenous ancestors, commentators invented grand narratives of vanished civilizations to explain the earthworks. Yet, while 19th-century newspapers were busy inventing giant warriors out of misread copper and scattered femurs, a completely different, genuine human disappearance was quietly being preserved in the oral accounts of the far north. In the harsh coastal expanses of the Arctic Archipelago, Inuit storytellers were speaking of a very real, physically formidable people who had vanished from the ice long before the first European survey ship arrived, raising the question of what scientific evidence would eventually emerge when researchers finally tested those Arctic memories. For decades, academic institutions treated Inuit accounts of the Tuniit as mere mythology, a colorful northern folktale about a race of physically formidable giants who inhabited the Arctic before the expansion of the Thule culture. European explorers and mid-20th century ethnographers assumed these stories were symbolic narratives created to explain the massive stone structures, heavy gravel sod foundations, and fox traps scattered across the high tundra of the Arctic archipelago. The moment the way of looking changed occurred not through traditional archaeology, but when researchers began applying precise physical measurements and laboratory science to the material culture of the North. In 1925, Diamond Jeunesse, an anthropologist with the National Museum of Canada, examined a distinct collection of small, exceptionally finely carved ivory and bone artifacts recovered from Cape Dorset on Baffin Island. The implements, tiny harpoon heads, miniature face masks, and delicate needles, were distinctly different from Thule or modern Inuit technology. They belonged to what Jeunesse formally designated as the Dorset culture, yet for nearly a century, a critical question remained unresolved. Were the Dorset simply the direct biological ancestors of the Inuit who had gradually adapted their toolmaking, or were they an entirely distinct human population that had completely disappeared? The definitive scientific proof emerged in 2014 through an international genetic study led by researchers who extracted and analyzed ancient mitochondrial and nuclear DNA recovered from hair, bone, and tooth samples preserved in permafrost across Greenland and Arctic Canada. Using high-throughput genomic sequencing and radiocarbon dating, the team mapped the genetic profiles of Dorset remains spanning thousands of years and compared them directly against ancient Thule remains and living Inuit populations. The results settled the debate with mathematical precision. The Dorset culture represented a genetically isolated population that had entered North America across the Bering Strait around 3000 BCE, completely separate from the later Thule migration that occurred around 1200 CE. The DNA evidence confirmed that when the Dorset vanished from the Arctic record around the 14th century, they left virtually no genetic trace in the modern Inuit population. Inuit oral tradition had maintained for centuries that the Tuniit were a distinct, immensely strong, and separate people who inhabited the ice before being displaced. The genomic sequencing proved that the oral record was fundamentally accurate. An entire, distinct human lineage had held the North for over 3 millennia before vanishing entirely. Meanwhile, back in southern Ontario, a very different scientific instrument was being applied to the 19th century claims of giant skeletons. In the 1940s, archaeologist Kenneth Kidd from the Royal Ontario Museum conducted a systematic excavation of a Huron-Wendat ossuary at the Ossuary site near Georgian Bay. Using modern stratigraphic mapping, careful bone measurement, and taphonomic analysis, Kidd demonstrated how soil movement, root growth, and improper assembly of disarticulated skeletons in unscientific 19th century digs had systematically created inflated height measurements. When professional osteologists applied formal forensic standards to ancient remains, the average stature of individuals in these ossuaries aligned precisely with standard human biology. The 7-foot and 8-foot giants reported in 19th century news items dissolved under the metric tape of physical anthropology. With the myths of giant warriors dismantled and the reality of a vanished Arctic population scientifically proven, a far more challenging question emerged. Why did thousands of genuine ancestral remains recovered across Canada disappear into museum drawers for a century? And what changed to finally bring them back to the ground? The legacy of these 19th-century excavations and 20th-century museum acquisitions has created a profound operational and legal reality for Canadian institutions today. Across Canada, major research university archives, provincial museums, and federal repositories hold thousands of catalogued human remains and associated funerary objects gathered over more than a century of unchecked collecting. These collections were not established through a single coordinated effort, but through tens of thousands of individual donations, archaeological field surveys, municipal infrastructure excavations, and private acquisitions. In the United States, federal legislation passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, established a unified, mandatory legal framework requiring federally funded institutions to inventory Indigenous remains and return them to linear descendant nations. Canada has no single equivalent federal statute. Instead, the present-day reality relies on a complex network of provincial legislation, such as Ontario's Funeral, Burial, and Cremation Services Act, alongside individual municipal policies, university protocols, and direct bilateral agreements negotiated between Indigenous nations and holding institutions. This decentralized framework means that the work of identification and repatriation is often slow, exacting, and resource-intensive. Major cultural institutions, including the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, and the University of Toronto, maintain dedicated policies to facilitate repatriation request reviews. The scope of this process is immense. The Canadian Museum of History alone has documented and repatriated hundreds of ancestral remains and thousands of cultural objects over the last 3 decades, working directly with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis representatives. Similar initiatives across university anthropology departments have resulted in the formal return and reburial of ancestral remains from sites across southern Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes. For contemporary infrastructure, construction, and land development, the consequences are immediate and visible every day on the ground. When modern highway expansions, residential subdivisions, or pipeline rights-of-way are planned in areas like the Grand River Valley or the Simcoe Uplands, archaeological assessment is mandatory under provincial heritage laws. Before a single excavator shovel touches the soil, licensed archaeologists conduct Stage 1 and Stage 2 environmental and cultural heritage assessments. They map historical drainage patterns, soil composition, and known historical sites to calculate archaeological potential. Field crews systematically test pit the terrain at 5-meter or 10-meter intervals, screening topsoil through 6mm wire mesh to check for worked flint, pottery fragments, or soil discoloration. If an unmapped burial or ossuary is encountered during construction, work halts instantly under strict legal protocol. The local police, the provincial coroner's office, and relevant First Nations communities are notified immediately. The site transforms from an active commercial build into a protected heritage space. What was once treated in 1871 as a sensational news item to be dug up and exhibited is now approached with legal precision, scientific restraint, and cultural responsibility. The shifting relationship between science, geography, and memory has fundamentally altered how Canadians read their landscape. Yet, beyond the ossuaries of Ontario and the genomic mapping of the Dorset culture in the Arctic, one remarkable documented case stands apart: the life and legacy of an actual Canadian giant whose story brings all of these threads together. The one verified case of a historical giant in Canada belonged not to ancient folklore or misread copper artifacts, but to a living Métis man named Edouard Beaupré. Born in 1881 in Willowbunch, in what is now southern Saskatchewan, Beaupré was the eldest of 20 children. By age 3, his body began growing at an abnormal rate caused by a pituitary gland tumor, a condition known medically as gigantism. By the time he reached adulthood, he measured 2 meters and 53 centimeters in height and weighed over 170 kilograms. Unable to work as a cowboy due to his extreme stature, Beaupré joined traveling exhibition shows across North America as a strongman, lifting horses to earn a living. He died of a pulmonary hemorrhage in St. Louis in 1904 at just 23 years of age. What followed was a decades-long institutional failure. Instead of being returned to his family in Saskatchewan, Beaupré's body was embalmed, passed between promoters, and eventually acquired by the University of Montreal, where it was kept as a scientific specimen in storage for 86 years. It was not until 1990, after sustained efforts by his descendants and the Métis community of Willowbunch, that his remains were formally returned, cremated, and buried in his home soil near the Willowbunch Museum. What kept these anomalies misunderstood for so long was not a conspiracy of silence, but a fundamental unwillingness in early survey practice to recognize that the land was already layered with human history long before official maps were drawn. What remains unresolved is the true number of unmapped ossuaries and burial sites still sitting beneath active agricultural ground and urban development across the country. As coastal erosion accelerates along Arctic shorelines and permafrost thaws across the Northwest Territories and Yukon, ancient Dorset and Thule sites are eroding into the Beaufort Sea before archaeologists can catalog them. The published map sheet appears complete and settled, but the ground beneath it is constantly opening up to reveal what was missed. Which historical anomaly or overlooked site in your own province or territory has always made you reconsider the landscape around you? If you find value in these detailed geographical investigations, consider subscribing to the channel to support future research.